Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to this week's Q&A. Yes, I'm wearing the same shirt that I just wore on the roundup, but I really wanted to wear this one in a video that I'm working on today that hopefully will be out this weekend. So yes, I did shower and wash my clothes. I haven't just kind of rolled around since Tuesday night. And also, it's been a war zone outside all day today, so I imagine this Q&A is going to be pretty noisy. I got the windows closed. There's not much else I could do about it, so I'm really sorry. If you're listening in your car, maybe just be careful because there's probably going to be a horn or a scream or, I don't know, cannon fire. But anyway, let's jump into the Q&As. Okay, first up, Marco Vizzini said he's confused with the Gstart's sync regeneration and wants to know if it's a different name for sync stripping. So no, it's slightly a different thing. So basically, the sync strippers that we in the retro gaming community have been using for a while are designed to just take any signal that includes the sync pulse, like composite video, Luma, and strip out nothing but that signal, and then amplify it a bit. Which is why if you ever put it in a SCART head, you're supposed to put a resistor after the sync stripper. Sync regeneration is almost like language translation, for lack of a better description. I could talk for a long time about this, so I'm going to try to oversimplify just to make it easy. But imagine, one device is talking in one language, another device isn't so good at that language, so there's an interpreter in the middle. That's essentially what it's doing. So the console's like Master System, where if you were to put the signal on a scope, it's not a perfectly square wave. There's other stuff going on. So this sync regeneration reads that sync signal and then rewrites it to be a proper 75 ohm C-sync signal. And as far as the Gstart's sync regeneration, voltage doesn't play so much into it because it lands at a level that's not too high for SCART devices, but high enough where other devices that normally might not be able to read that signal would. And I've tested every version of the Gstart, and then I've retested it on the scope. And I've spoken to Marcus, the open source scan converter creator, as well as a bunch of other people, and they've all confirmed that it's completely safe to use, meaning the Gstart is safe to use on their devices. So while it's a little bit higher, I think it's almost 900 millivolts that it outputs, it's totally fine. While that really wouldn't have anything to do with voltage as far as compatibility, it is a cool side effect where I think you'll be able to use the sync regeneration on things like the data path card. So if you're already using a console that has a low pass filter in it, maybe you could just get a SCART to VGA or DVI adapter. So I guess that's just an extra bonus. And just to answer your question directly without all of that rambling, it's different than sync stripping because it rewrites the signal in real time and doesn't strip and then just spit out something else. One other bonus too is there's a slight delay while using original sync strippers that causes the entire screen to shift over just one pixel if you're looking at it on a digital display, because we all know that CRTs don't have pixels. Whereas sync regeneration is done in real time, so there is no shift. It is the exact same location on the screen that it would have been. So I think that covers it all. Hopefully, ask me again if I didn't explain it right or if you need anything else. RGB since 92 had a great question, and I want to add something to it afterwards. So just to answer the question first, do you know of a zero lag VGA to HDMI converter? In fact, most of the ones that I found are zero lag, because if all you're doing is an analog to digital conversion, in almost every case that I've seen, no lag was added. It's only when the signal is converted in some way that lag is added, like in an upscaler or I think I've seen other situations where the signal had to be manipulated, not just analog to digital. So I would just pick up one of the cheap ones. Chris Larson mentioned the 10 DAC one. I've heard mixed things about that because I've heard people post their results with the 10 DAC and the OSSC, and it looks great. Looks 99% as good as a much more expensive one. And I've run into a few situations where a different one looked better. So I would start with the 10 DAC. I think it's like 15 bucks or something. So it's a great place to start. And if it's good enough, then it's good enough. But I wouldn't worry about lag. I would only worry about things like the black levels and how it interprets color. But you also mentioned that you were using that for your Mister so that you can get you don't have to use the built-in scaler. Have you updated the Mister yet? Because the new scaling options are, I mean, there's a lot more than there was back in October when I tested, almost 6 months ago. And I keep talking to Raisha. I keep meaning to take the time to do another lag test on the new scalers, but I'm drowning. I gotta get through these other projects before I can, but give it a shot. Maybe that'll help. And I'll definitely have some hard numbers for people soon. And there's of course different settings. So there's the lower latency settings. There's the settings that add a frame buffer so you don't see screen tearing in certain console cores. So I would mess with that a little bit and see if you get better results. You might not need the 10 DAC. But in my opinion, if you're a tinkerer like I am, for the $15, I would buy it because you're probably going to use it at some other point. Aaron Marks had some questions about his BVM D20. Love that monitor. First, I guess he's been able to get a picture that's perfectly straight aside from a vertical bow on the left side of the screen. If he corrects that, then it throws off the alignment in the middle. Welcome to CRT geometry. Is there any way to adjust a single edge of the screen? So depending on what you're talking about, if it's just a bow in the upper corner, you might need to use conversion strips. If it's the entire left side of it, it sounds like you would need, that could be a result of some of the capacitors not working up to spec, so they're aging and need to be replaced, and that's why you're getting that. So that's your question too. Do you have any advice about locating someone to do a cap replacement on your BVM D20? So if you could find somebody in Seattle that has experience with all of this, then yeah, that would be great. I don't think I know anybody, but that would be ideal because that way you could just have somebody do everything right there. If not, I would contact Pat, Pat the BVM tech, and he's going to ask you to take out all of the cards from your BVM. He's going to replace only the caps that he knows go bad, which some people have some issues with. Some people think you should replace all of them. He said that in all of his years of doing this, he's seen a bunch that never go bad and still test perfect with an ISR meter. So I got to trust him on this one. And not only that, he'll calibrate the cards to each other. And that's something that I didn't even know until the last interview I did with him in person, and that a lot of the calibration can be done right there on the cards themselves, and then you just need to do the final tweaking for your CRT. So if you're already comfortable playing with the alignment on it and everything, then that should be fine as a last step. And I would just let him take care of all of that. It's kind of expensive, but you get what you pay for. And if you could afford it, the dude's been a gigantic help to everyone in the retro gaming scene. So I certainly, whenever I have the opportunity to, don't mind paying for his work, because I feel like every time somebody pays his prices, we're also taking one for the team because he's helped a lot of people out. Also, have I had a chance to test the latest revision of the SSD S3? No, but Mobius Strip Tech and Firebrand X has, and they both sign off on it, so I completely believe them. The only problem I have is it's still hard to figure out which version you're getting from resellers. So I believe if you buy it directly from them, it's still, you'll get the new version, and I think Stone Age Gamer sold out of the old version and has the new version, but I haven't been able to get anybody's confirmation on that. And lastly, why is it standard for Genesis and SNES to output TTL if it could damage SCART equipment? Do you prefer when modding to output TTL or 75 ohm? So I'm going to give you the short answer because the full answer would take forever. But I believe they did that as a cost savings, and because the way the SCART standard worked in Europe is you would just use composite video as sync. So that's why you don't even get a sync pin on the PlayStation console, because all of their cables just use composite video. And from the cost, if you think about having to add these different components for each region, so, a different region board for NTSC, different region for PAL, if you think in the terms of how many millions of units were sold, leaving all of this stuff off the board, so that $2 worth of parts, maybe a little more, would have equated to millions of dollars at the end of the console's lifespan. So knowing that RGB wasn't something that was used widely worldwide, I assume that they left them off for that reason, and that way you could just, they would say, all right, here, buy our cable, and we'll stick the extra components in that cable. So that's my guess. But my very strong opinion is that whenever you're modding your consoles, you make sure they output exactly what they modded from the factory. Because the fact is, somebody else at some point will probably use that console. Or you might even forget. So if you've modded one that outputs direct 75 ohm C-Sync on the sync pin, and then you make yourself a custom pass-through cable with no components in it, electrically speaking, that's better. It's better practice. You could technically get a 0.01 better video signal out of the RGB lines. Nothing noticeable. But the problem I have with that is at some point in time, somebody else, or even yourself, is going to grab a standard Genesis SCART cable, plug that thing in, and it's not going to work. Sync's going to be too low for most things, and it just won't sync, and somebody's going to think, oh, this thing isn't working right, and throw it out. And that's the thing that drives me nuts about a lot of these mods. Or some of them where you could put a different cable in and potentially cause harm. Like, there were a few people I knew that were that took their own personal PAL SNESes, cut voltage, and put C-Sync to that pin. That's great, but what if somebody doesn't know any better and uses a C-Sync cable on a non-modded PAL SNES, then you're sending 12 volts to your device. So that's why. It's just a general safety thing, and I just, it's just something that even the people that disagree with me have to admit that all the consoles that we've seen have some kind of issue because of that, just because people forgot you need the custom cable, whatever else. So that's why I never use the Genesis 2 connector on any other device that I'm modding. I always use that pass-through connector, and that's why I always tell people to make sure you do it to whatever the industry standard was for that console, just so you don't have to worry. And no matter what happens in that console's lifetime, you order a Super Nintendo and a Super Nintendo C-Sync cable, and you're done. So I'll end that one now. I think that was even a little too ranty, but I could do a whole full episode on this and show examples, although I'm sure nobody wants me to, so I won't. Adam Yeager said he saw in another Q&A that the OSSC is my favorite, probably meaning my favorite upscaler. And do I run the standard firmware or do I run a custom firmware? So I haven't had nearly as much time to mess with it as I would have liked to. In a perfect world, I would have time to try all of the firmwares and kind of screw around with it. But what I ended up doing was I used the latest official firmware with Firebrand X's settings. But as with anything in the expert realm of retro gaming, the more you learn, the more you have to learn. So now every time, rather than use generic mode, which always looked fine, some people complained about the way it looked, the Perfectionist did, but it was good enough for gaming. But now every time I fire up a console, I go into the menu, I select Firebrand X's settings, then I go in, and because I almost never use the same console twice, even my stationary setup barely gets used. I'm mostly doing testing. So with each console, then I go in and I set the phase and I set the sync filtering on it. So it's customized profiles from the original official firmware, or whatever's the latest. And it drives me a little nuts, but it's only something that I would run into. If you have a setup at home, and you plug in your console with your cable, like let's say you have 5 consoles into a Gstart into the OSSC, once you've set those custom settings and then resaved, so you use Firebrand X's as your jumping off point, tweak each console the way that he recommends, save those settings. It's just a matter of turn on the OSSC, grab the remote, select which setting for which console you're using, you're done, and it's awesome. And I don't think any of the custom firmwares could get you any better performance than that. But you'll often hear me complain about the advanced features of the OSSC for my scenario, which every time I'm testing I have a new console and possibly a new cable, so I have to reset all of those things and recalibrate and retweak it, which is why I've been using the data path direct capture method, because for me personally, the only thing I have to worry about in that scenario is setting the phase. So yeah, it was probably too much information than what you had asked, but I just figured I would explain the whole thing, because a few other people had also asked me the other side of it, why had they heard me complain about the OSSC, and I was not actually complaining about the OSSE. I was complaining about how many different consoles I end up testing. Chris Larson was posting about the Time Sleuth review, and I'm not going to reread it all on camera. I do appreciate all of the info and feedback, but one thing I definitely will suggest is if you'd like to see more modes, just contact Dan and see if it's feasible. If it's something easy, Christoph might just add that into his firmware. And if it's not, they might not be able to get to 120 hertz, 144 hertz support, but I think it would be cool just to test that out. And you also bring up display lag and refresh rate and all that stuff. And yeah, I think that's getting into a different type of testing. So I'm not sure if the Time Sleuth would be able to do stuff like that. And I'm even actually working on a video right now where I have to talk a little bit about the difference between lags. And I wish there was better nomenclature, because when I say input lag, what I'm thinking of is, like, let's say I'm even using a CRT, the time it takes from the time you press the button to the time the character moves. And input, I'm probably using the wrong word, but input lag is something that's software related, whether it's the game's programming or emulation or whatever else. But when I say display lag, I'm talking about if you have the same source going to a CRT and an LCD, how much lag is added on that LCD. And then, of course, there's the actual refresh rate on the screen, which is why sometimes if you have a character running fast across the screen on an LCD, you'll get that blur that you were talking about. So I've heard that referred to as display lag. I've heard input latency. I've heard a lot of different things. I've always just called that the refresh rate. But yeah, maybe I'm wrong. Post down below if there already is perfectly good nomenclature for this and I'm using it wrong. Let me know and I'll change. But it is still confusing to me, even though it's something I work with all the time. And I think there would have to be a different way to test that final latency that you're talking about, the blurring on the screen, refreshing. I don't know. Kevin Ego wanted to know where I got the plastic standoffs for the Voltar SCART to BNC boards that he made a while back, the pass-through boards. And I believe I got these from Mobius Strip Tech. I can't really remember correctly, and I believe he shipped with these on, and I think those are perfect. Let me see if I can get a good close-up for people watching on video. And the reason I liked them so much is because they're plastic, I was able to just take wood screws. Let's see if I can get that in focus too. Just basic wood screws that were short, so I wasn't going too deep in these. And on one monitor I mounted it on, it just so happened that the vent holes lined up perfectly. But on one of them, one of the holes was a little off, so the screw went in at a tiny bit of an angle. But the only thing that was affected was the standoff. So, the board wasn't being flexed or bent. It's just, instead of going straight in, it went just a hair at an angle, which is fine. I mean, what's the worst that could happen? The standoff breaks again? Oh well. So I love the almost dropped it. Love these things. The only thing I found too is I wanted this one on my second RGB input on my BVM D32, and I found some cheap BNC cables that worked great. But just like those cheap RCA to BNC connectors, sometimes like if you wiggle it, you see the signal kind of get messed up. So I asked Steve from HD Retrovision, and he gave me a link to these really high-end single BNC cables, and they were like $20 each. So going this route certainly isn't going to save you any money over just a SCART to BNC pre-made cable, but I think it's for really higher-end solutions, I really like it. And to be honest, I'd even like to see one of these that's built and designed for the Rigel DS1054 scopes, so that you could hook this up, hook these into the BNC connectors. You'd have to have 75 ohm termination right on here, and that way you could just have an input directly into the Rigel. So maybe I'll talk to the fellow nerds and see if they could make that happen. But I'll see if I could ask Mobius, or maybe if you get to it before me, where you got these plastic standoffs from. And thanks again for bringing down the Neo Geo dev team games. That was a total blast. Dave Sobel had a dangerous question. How does one get started with arcade collecting? Well, you save up a lot of money and expect it all to be gone. All kidding aside, you asked how I started. I started just by wanting a Mortal Kombat machine. I'd always wanted one, so I bought it. Loved it, and then I wanted to put an emulation computer in there too, just so I could, mess around for fun with other games, knowing there's emulation and lag and bugs and stuff like that. And I got lucky and just bought a JAMA harness, wired it up, configured the software, and it worked. But if you were going to go about doing it that way, I would make sure that you always double check the wiring harness and the compatibility of the monitor. So the CRT that was inside the Mortal Kombat machine was compatible with 15 kilohertz and 24 kilohertz signals. Whereas if I had put a Mortal Kombat board in a Street Fighter machine, it might not have worked. The monitor might not have been compatible. So that's one thing to look for. But basically, if you want to just get started, pick your favorite stand-up arcade game, buy it, and then research from there how to get other stuff into it. The JAMA harness pinout is number one most important. The certain games, like all the Midway games that use 24 kilohertz monitors, that's pretty much how I would start out. And from there, that adding the computer was just dumb luck that it happened to be the same JAMA pinout. I think I may have double checked it, or maybe I just plugged it in to see if it would work. But how I really got started, years after I had bought and then sold that machine, was really because of the Brooklyn crew and just tagging along to Jose and nagging him incessantly, asking all these questions, because they do kind of what you're talking about. Can one start with a candy cab and swap boards? Well, that's exactly what they do, and that's what Beast still does with his. And the factors are, I'm sorry to repeat myself, but it's super important. Checking the JAMA pinout to see if the board is compatible or if it needs any changes. And then seeing if the monitor is compatible, which his are. And then each time you switch boards, you might have to adjust brightness, color settings. So if you just want it to look fine, you could find a happy medium between your favorite 3 or 4 boards, and it'll always be good enough. But Tech, who used to hang out down at iFix, whenever they did a big important stream, he would go in and make sure to calibrate that board both for the monitor and for the stream. So if you're a perfectionist, that's why I kind of joked about this being dangerous. Not just for the money factor, but there's going to be a ton of tinkering involved. And your comment, I agree with 100% that the site's great for consoles, but, where do you learn about arcade? The reason I haven't even started adding arcade stuff is because it's just so overwhelming. Each game is almost like its own console. Each console has its own board revisions, so do the games. So that's something that I really hope once the wiki opens, which I've actually been in talks with people, so that might be sooner rather than later. But that's where I hope people will just, once we set a template, people will just start dumping information, arcade board pictures, any info like that, and then kind of do it the opposite of retro RGB. Then once the info's there, then go back and write the easy guides. Whereas my site started as, here's some easy guides. I don't quite know what I'm talking about yet, but let's, we're in, let's do it. And then I went back and added all the extra technical information and stuff like that. So yeah, I hope to get there soon, but that's basically my suggestion, is just buy yourself a cab, try to find of your favorite game, and just do a little bit of research to make sure it would be compatible with other stuff. Or if you're just looking to get into arcade boards, get one of those super guns that's safe, that's designed with safety in mind, like the Haas, the Sentinel, and that way you don't have to worry about voltage or anything crazy. You just buy a cable and hook it into your existing SCART setup, and then you just use all the different boards there. So any other questions, let me know. I'm not an expert, but I certainly have already jumped over all the beginner hurdles, and I'm getting past the intermediate range. So if you run into any issues, ask, and I'll see if I can help. And I love the boards that I've collected. I really wish I still had a Mortal Kombat machine. I wouldn't have any place to put it, but yeah. So good luck, and let me know if you end up getting a candy cab. Those are awesome. John Villay wanted to know if anyone knows of a battery holder that would fit inside a Tenuki bank. That way you don't have to worry about desoldering one and fitting it in. I don't know. I don't think so. I would assume that there probably isn't, but if anybody knows the answer, please definitely post down below in this week's. And yeah, I mean, that's a tough one. That's kind of another reason I was really liking the SSD S3 after it was modded, of course, because you just don't have to worry about that stuff anymore. So, good question. Jason D asked if there's any preventative maintenance you would recommend for a PS2 FAT. I would just check the laser. If you have a scope, check it, see if it needs to be replaced. I think some people have talked about greasing the gears, and then people have the different, their favorite different grease methods. But I think that would be it. I'm not sure if anybody has talked about bad caps on a PS2 FAT yet. I'm sure it's going to happen at some point, but I'm not sure if I've heard of that being an issue. The only other thing I would check is if you're comfortable working in a PS2, because it's way harder than a Super Nintendo or anything else. There's certain model PS2 FATs where if you do the C-Sync mod to it, everything else still works. So that's the one, the one hesitation is with many models, and I would say most models PS2, if you do the C-Sync mod on it, you obviously would lose composite video, whatever, but you also lose component video. So for me personally, I don't care. That's exactly what I want. I just want RGBS out with all resolutions, nothing else. But there is the one version of the FAT that Cousin Scott has now, actually, where when you disable composite video in Luma, and I have C-Sync going to both of those, component video still works. So I think it's one of the older versions of it. So if you have those, I would recommend, and you're comfortable working in such tight quarters, I would recommend doing that, just because all you would lose is composite or S-video. And if I remember correctly, you might even be able to leave S-video and just have composite like that. So yeah, those are really just my suggestions. But if anybody else, if I missed anything and somebody's a PS2 expert, please post down below. Well, that's it for this week. For any new subscribers, please post any questions you have wherever you found that video. So be it in the subscription section of YouTube, Bitbacker, Subscribestar, Patreon, wherever. All I know is I usually try to turn off the comments on YouTube. Sometimes I forget and do it afterwards, but this really is focused on everybody who subscribes, because it's really just a small way of me saying thank you to all of you. And then about a month after it goes live to subscribers, it goes live on YouTube for everybody, just kind of as a courtesy and for fun. But this really is just a thank you to subscribers. So post wherever you found it. Also, just kind of the way things happen, I'm not able to go back and check any of the older posts. So please post whatever you have on the newest one available. And if I've missed your question, please re-ask. Sometimes I accidentally lose the section. Sometimes it comes in as I'm recording, so it didn't show up in time. But either way, if I missed it, just re-ask, and I'll get to it next week. And as always, thank you so much for all your support, because none of the things could happen without your support. None of the behind-the-scenes work, none of the testing, none of the videos, and of course the weekly podcast and Q&As. So thank you so much. I hope I'm making it all worthwhile, and I'm going to continue to try to post more content and do more things. So thank you very much, and I'll see you next week.